beautiful for spacious skies, for amber waves of grain, ooh, for purple mountain, for majesties above the fruity plain.
What did I just watch? So far in this challenging year, we've had a few instances of what I might call bad patriotic shit. Most notably, we've had the Capitol Hill insurrection, during which Trump fans stormed the US Capitol building waving US and Confederate flags in an attempt to overturn the election of Joe Biden. In the UK, we've had patriotism linked to the production of the coronavirus vaccine, with apparent plans to print the Union flag on the bottles of the Oxford vaccine in an apparent attempt to remind everyone that this is a good British vaccine, much better than those rubbish foreign vaccines, which has apparently had some folk refusing to take coronavirus vaccines which aren't the British one, which is just so sad. We've also had the Labour Party try to wrap itself up in the flag in order to project itself to some mythical, patriotic, real working class. France has had some recent evil too, with recent government investigations into Islamo-leftist academia, which is infiltrating and unduly influencing good French culture. Even though we all know from Tom Nicholas that France is fake. #France is fake. But there's still been attempts to redeem patriotism for the left, and in some cases people just seem blind to the damage that reifying, particularly the imperial or colonial nation state, can do. So in this video I'm going to make the case that we should abandon patriotism, abandon love or fealty or duty to a particular nation state, and instead find new ways to express our political ideas. So in this video I do focus on the US and the UK context, mainly because it's the two states I've lived in and know best, but also because they provide just really good examples, stock examples of the issues that I'm talking about. It doesn't mean that these issues are only relevant to the US and the UK. On settler-colonialism, the issues will be generalisable to settler-colonial states across the world. And when talking more fundamentally about the structure of the state in relation to racial capitalism, that will be far more generalisable beyond just the UK and the US. This is me in post trying to cover my ass on maybe being too Anglocentric. So with that being said, back to the video. By patriotism, I want to be clear that what I mean is feelings of love or pride or responsibility towards a particular nation state. Being attached to land or your community or to a tradition of struggle which is born within a particular country isn't, in my view, patriotism, and I think it would actually be harmful to label it as such. So with that, let's do a quick God Save the Queen and let's get going. Part 1. America First. America First was a campaign slogan for Donald Trump. Its purpose was to highlight that Trump was a patriot, that he would reassert American dominance on the world stage, and that Americans should be proud to be considered the chosen people of Earth.
From this day forward, It's going to be only America first. America first.
America first.
This was reflected elsewhere in instances like Trump claiming Mexicans were flooding over the border, committing crimes and raping American women.
They're bringing drugs, they're bringing crime, they're rapists, and some, I assume, are good people.
Mexicans in this case were innately less than Americans. They were framed as an evil force from outside, a horde invading the country, and Donald Trump would protect it. Do you like my t-shirt? Pretty awful, isn't it? I feel like someone's gonna clip this and I'm gonna get cancelled in like 5 years. It's like secretly a right-winger and very deep cover. Clearly this American first patriotism is deeply inflected with white supremacy. Like, it's a point which finds more support in the fact that America First was literally the slogan of the American fascists. But if we drill down deeper into this particular Trumpism, we can start to interrogate the more important questions. Who gets to count as American? What even is America? So these questions can get you from the easy position that, oh yeah, the right wing uses patriotism to support its positions, to a more important position that patriotism within a settler colonial context like the US is innately reactionary. For those who might not know, settler colonialism refers to states like the USA, Canada, Israel or Australia, in which an area which was formerly occupied by a native group or groups is replaced by a new settler colonial state. Now, some people like to think of settler colonialism as an event which happened in the past, as like a foundation on which the state is built. In this way, it allows people to profess sort of remorse or regret for how native groups were treated by the settler state. It allows people to acknowledge the terrible violence and genocide that occurred in the past. But it does just that. It makes settler colonialism an event which happened in the past, something the state did, not something the state is. And that's even if you admit the genocide occurred at all. Please don't share this image out of context. And this relegation of the settler colonial process to an event which happened in the past is something which is essential to the continued genocide of native populations today. As Patrick Wolfe explained,
settler colonialism has both negative and positive dimensions. Negatively, it strives for the dissolution of native societies. Positively, it erects new colonial society on the expropriated land base. As I put it, settler colonizers come to stay. Invasion is a structure, not an event. In its positive aspect, elimination is an organising principle of settler colonial society, rather than a one-off and superseded occurrence. End quote. There. Now that I've let you be in one of my videos, can you please leave me alone? Oh, wasn't supposed to read that part. Sorry, man.
It's a process of continued primitive accumulation in which land is constantly taken from the native populations, sometimes through force, but sometimes through less overtly violent means, like assimilation into the settler colonial state. And the way that the genocide and the native peoples themselves are framed as just a thing of the past is central to maintaining the legitimacy of the settler colonial state and thereby maintaining the continued genocide of native peoples. Patriotism plays a central role in justifying this continued genocide. The US and, any state has to continue to legitimise itself, and it does this through engendering feelings of loyalty or belonging to the particular nation state. You should be proud to be an American, and if there's something that doesn't make you proud, well then, maybe that doesn't matter too much. Maybe it happened a long time ago, and we're better than that now. Maybe it didn't even happen in the first place. America stands for freedom. It doesn't do genocide. At least not anymore. And if America does it, well then, it can't be genocide then. And in fact, as Indigenous scholar Nick Estes has pointed out, this US patriotism has been used as a direct tool of this genocide, as a means through which it it's been enacted. By indoctrinating Indigenous children with US patriotism through the school system, the state has sought to assimilate Indigenous kids into the settler colonial state, thereby further destroying them as a people. Coulthard makes a similar point, that when settler colonialism doesn't just rely on overt violence, it often finds ways to make Indigenous groups identify with the settler state, which thereby further wears away the existence of sovereign native nations, which continues the genocide. America First, then, is more than just a racist dog whistle, it's an entire organising principle of the settler colonial state. The American state is supreme, it is above the nations its very existence is destroying. You know, it's funny, lots of American liberals are really quick to recognise that the Confederate flag is a symbol of, like an awful symbol of slavery and oppression to black people, and they laugh at the idea that anyone flies it just for Southern pride. But when it comes to the Star-Spangled Banner, well, that stands for freedom. That doesn't stand for the continued genocide of Indigenous peoples. Funny. The other side to America First is something that Britain is more than a little bit acquainted with. Imperialism. The one thing we do, Britain, exporter of imperialism. Some people spoke of Trump as if he forestalled American imperialism, but I think that's just silly. The whole project of America First was about reasserting a more boorish vision of American imperialism, where rather than hiding behind the cloak of a rules-based international system, America would just demand shit.
Every decision on trade, on taxes, on immigration, on foreign affairs will be made to benefit American workers and American families.
I mean, the Trump administration just assassinated one of Iran's leaders in full view. They liked imperialism, they were just often too incompetent to do it well. Trump was a dipshit, but he was an imperial dipshit. An imperial dipshit. Imperial dipshit sounds like the worst brand of shower gel. What's that smell? Oh, this? Imperial dipshit. From L'Oreal. Stupid joke. That's a stupid joke. But this isn't to say that Trumpism is really anything different in the long history of American imperialism. For centuries now, the US has been invading nation states, toppling democratically elected governments, and supporting dictators, all in the name of America First. Really highlights the lie that America could ever stand as a symbol of freedom or democracy. This imperialism is also tied to the great lie that America is open to everyone, that it's a great melting pot. As Dunbar Ortiz points out, non-white immigrants have often been recruited to be at the forefront of expanding both settler colonialism and imperialism. Some immigrants find paths to US citizenship through active participation in the US military and being at the forefront of the imperial project, yet no matter how hard they try, how much they wave the flag, the white supremacy inherent to the system will always impede them.
The requirements for their formal citizenship were simple. Adhere to the sacred covenant through taking the citizenship oath, pledging loyalty to the flag, and regarding those outside the covenant as enemies or potential enemies of the exceptional country that had adopted them. Often after they had escaped hunger, war or repression, which in turn were often caused by US militarism or economic sanctions. Yet no matter how much immigrants might strive to prove themselves to be as hard-working and patriotic as descendants of the original settlers, and despite the rhetoric of e pluribus unum, they are suspect.
No matter how much an immigrant, and particularly a non-white immigrant, demonstrates their patriotism, they will always still be subject to the white supremacism inherent to the capitalist settler colonial state. But when it comes to empire, nobody does it quite like Britain. In Britain, almost half the population is actively proud of the British Empire, which is quite a startling figure considering all the genocide, slavery and destruction that it caused for centuries. And yet patriotism has allowed Britain to sanitise its past, to view itself as a civilising force rather than a genocidal one, which reinforces white supremacy throughout British society.
But you look at the fact that we introduced parliamentary democracy to a lot of countries, the sort of civil service system of government, which all of these countries, or a lot of these countries, are still using today. They've stood...
Black and brown people are viewed as requiring civilising. Their lives are viewed as inherently less valuable than white lives, which not only justifies white supremacy within the state, but also justifies neo-imperialism abroad. It justifies ignoring global south states of largely black and brown populations when they tell us that global warming is already destroying their ways of life. And there's some folk who are like, a true patriotism is about learning and reckoning with your country's past, but like, I mean, that seems like a stretch of the word patriotism to me. And also like, why do you need patriotism to do it? Why not just do it? You don't need to be patriotic to learn about your past, just learn it. And then like, if you've learned all of the stuff that the British state did and still does, and you're still patriotic and you're still proud to be British, why? Why? What is there to be proud of? Just why? In both Britain and the US, patriotism, imperialism and white supremacy are all absolutely and innately tied together. Patriotism means white America first. It means white Britain first. Please don't clip either of those things to use against me. So many cancelable moments in this video for you sneaky little pisshogs. But there's still a more fundamental level we can get to here, and that's to question the idea of the nation state itself. Part 2. The state and racial capitalism. It's easy when you live in a time, well, I suppose we all live in a time, it's easy when
You live in a society.
to think that how things are now is how they have always been and how they should always be. Capitalism has always existed, it's permanent, as is the nation state. But that's a trick. Before the nation state, serfs rarely felt any love or fealty towards their king. Certainly not in the way that people feel pride or love for their nation state today. In Black Marxism, Cedric Robinson argues that the nation state and capitalism are innately tied together.
European civilization is not the product of capitalism. On the contrary, the character of capitalism can only be understood in the social and historical context of its European appearance.
Robinson's point is that capitalism is a particular development of the European context, and that the nation state is a particularly European structure which was essential to the development of capitalism. It's a structure which can't be untangled from the particular European development of capitalism. And essentially, this is innately linked to racialization and the development of white supremacy.
The bourgeoisie that led the development of capitalism were drawn from particular ethnic and cultural groups. The European proletariats and the mercenaries of the leading states from others, its peasants from still other cultures, and its slaves from entirely different worlds. The tendency of European civilization through capitalism was thus not to homogenize, but to differentiate, to exaggerate regional, subcultural, and dialectical differences into racial ones. As the Slavs became the natural slaves, the racially inferior stock for domination and exploitation during the early Middle Ages, as the Tartars came to occupy a similar position in the Italian cities of the late Middle Ages, so at the systemic interlocking of capitalism in the 16th century, the peoples of the Third World began to fill this expanding category of a civilization reproduced by capitalism.
Basically, the nation state, the object of our pride and our love, is a means through which racial capitalism develops. It's both a tool of disorganising the working classes, organising the ruling classes, and constructing the racial other. This is closely linked to the idea that every border is essentially a violent and racialising construct, keeping some people, the other, out of an area through threat of or directly violent means. Patriotism, then, can only support this notion of the nation state. And when the prime beneficiaries of the racialisation of the nation state is white people, it ultimately supports white supremacy on a fundamental level. And the reason that the nation state is viewed of as this eternal and universal thing is precisely because it was exported across the world through imperialism and capitalism. This is why when Frantz Fanon argued that when colonised people fight for their liberty, they should fight for a foundational break away from the background structures of settler colonialism, which is capitalism and the nation state. Otherwise, they risk reproducing white liberty and white justice, that is, values secreted by their masters. Nick Estes hinted at a similar point in his conversation with Mexi, which I'll link in the thingamajig. He pointed out that despite the fact that it's often indigenous people who get accused of trying to create ethno-states, it's actually the US which is fundamentally constituted to be an ethno-state. He argues that the American founders, didn't just hate indigenous people because they had land that the founders wanted, but because they represented an alternative political order. Indigenous peoples weren't organised in nation states and they weren't capitalistic, and that was a threat that needed to be crushed. He argues that the American Revolution was actually a counter-revolution, which is a spicy take that will get Americans mad, and fucking come at me. But he argues that the American Revolution wasn't a revolution for freedom against tyranny, but was in fact a counter-revolution against the spread of slavery abolitionism and the increasing power of indigenous groups in America. Post this great revolution of freedom against tyranny, slavery continued for another 100 years, and the genocide of indigenous people continues to this day. Patriotism reifies the structure of capitalism, of racialisation and of genocide, and tries to trick you into thinking that being American or being British or whatever is something to be proud of. That we owe something to this bureaucratic structure which has attached emotional value to itself, rather than that we owe something to each other no matter what, no matter where we come from or who we are. Those of us on the left should be actively rejecting patriotism, especially in settler colonial and imperial states. And this is why I think it's dangerous to turn traditions of radicalism into something that we should be patriotic about. Because if you take anti-capitalist traditions and try to tie them to a particular nation state, then you're actively reifying a structure that's existence is in direct opposition to your ideological goals. We shouldn't be seeking a better world because we love our country. We should be seeking a better world. Part 3. Performing patriotism. Another reason that we should avoid connecting radicalism to patriotism is because the way patriotism is performed is inextricably linked to the far right. And I can already hear people in the comment section saying things like, well, my patriotism is all about being anti-racist and being socialist, so why can't I celebrate patriotism like that? And putting aside all the issues that I've talked about already, the performance of patriotism, with all the flags and all the songs, can't be untangled from the genocidal state as it exists today. You'd have to find a way of performing that patriotism in a way which is separated from these symbols, which are symbols of genocide and fear, if not to you, then to indigenous peoples and to many people in the global south. And if you don't find new symbols, then you risk reinforcing that same damaging, negative, white supremacist patriotism of the far right as you try to reclaim them. Just think of my example from earlier of the Confederate flag. You can see a really good example of how mixed up the symbolism of patriotism can get from this tweet from the BBC's political editor, policy editor. Very different things, policy editor and political editor. If I got them mixed up, I would have looked like a right dick. You can see how mixed up this can get when he tweeted of the Capitol Hill riots.
I did an internship in the US Congress when I was a student. Something I admired was the complete veneration both sides showed to that building and to their political institutions. It's a dangerous moment, but it's also deeply, deeply sad.
You know, it struck me as incredible that a guy whose job it is to understand politics just couldn't get his head around the idea that there's a direct line from complete veneration of the institutions of the state to the Capitol Hill riots. Like, they're both reifying the same symbols and the same institutions. There's this total veneration of the state that permeates through all of American culture, from all the flags that are everywhere, to making children say a Pledge of Allegiance every day, to all the flags that are everywhere, to singing the national anthem before every sporting event, to all the flags that are everywhere. Seriously, there are so many flags. Is the US just a flag-based economy? What's going on? This veneration of the state is totally foundational for the far right, and that patriotism is simply often coded as white. So if we return to the Capitol Hill riots, they were convinced that their sacred institutions were under attack from foreigners and from communists. So they weren't being like treasonous, they were being patriotic defenders of the state. Things like freedom or revolution, when filtered through the lens of patriotism, just become buzzwords for the far right and white supremacists. So when liberals do stuff like this,
America is back, ready to lead the world, not retreat from it. Once again, sit at the head of the table.
or like this,
Can you say why America is the greatest country in the world?
Sure used to be. We stood up for what was right. We fought for moral reasons. We passed laws, struck down laws for moral reasons. We waged wars on poverty, not poor people. Cultivated the world's greatest artists and the world's greatest economy. And the world's greatest economy.
or whatever the fuck this is. They're reinforcing the idea that America is special, like a shining democratic beacon on the hill of freedom, of democracy. Something that needs protecting against dark forces. You can see the similar issues being played out in just like a beautiful way. A beautiful way. I'm becoming Italian. it's a beautiful way. When you can see this played out in a beautiful way in this image from the Labour Party in the UK. Now this could be read as that great trope of progressive patriotism, that real patriotism is just wanting the best for your countrymen. The problem is, that's what the far right want too. Except they start to define who is and who isn't their countrymen. And they could look at this graph and it's almost like it was designed this way. They could look at this graph and easily see the Labour Party standing with them and their racist views of who's really a citizen, who's really legitimate in the country. The main point I'm trying to make here is that even if you do believe in patriotism to some degree, performing that in a way which doesn't inadvertently reinforce right-wing narratives is pretty much impossible. Can you imagine sitting down on July 4th and you're pounding 12 beers and you're wearing your fucking star-spangled cape or whatever Americans do, and you're trying to make it clear that although you're doing these things, you're doing them to express your desire that to improve America, we should dissolve the state and capitalism to end the settler-colonial nature of life on that continent. I don't think it would work. And simply speaking, we just don't need patriotism. We don't need caring about communities, or place, or tradition, or left ideas to be tied up with patriotism and all the white supremacist, right-wing, settler-colonial and imperial baggage that it innately carries with it. We won't beat the far right or liberal capitalists in a war over defining the nature of patriotism. They'll always hold the power to define that narrative, so rather than trying to co-opt it, we should simply break it. Fuck patriotism, let's do international communism instead. You hogs can clip that one, and I encourage you to. Oh, thank God, we're at the conclusion. Whew. So this video has sought to examine patriotism from particularly within the Western imperialist or settler colonial context, and show why us on the left should ultimately reject patriotism. Settler colonial and imperial states are built on genocide and slavery, and the nation state itself exists to maintain racial capitalism. And patriotism itself is intractably connected with the far right and the ideological protection of many of the oppressions of the liberal state. The left can't rescue patriotism, and if we try, we risk reproducing the very things we're trying to overcome. We should focus not on building progressive patriotism, whatever that could mean, but instead on building solidarity between communities and peoples and workers across the globe, with the ultimate goal to end the liberal nation state and end capitalism itself. Ultimately, I think this clip from the Red Nation podcast, which is a podcast from radical indigenous activists, really sums up the issue of why patriotism can't be rescued and turned into something progressive. And it's because the cause of patriotism is liberalism. And liberalism is the root cause of the far right too.
The root cause of all of this is liberalism. I mean, it's like, it's the total hegemonic, authoritarian stranglehold that liberal democracy and the notion of the liberal nation state has on like the political imaginary. And so liberalism cannot actually exist without this gross mass inequality. It cannot exist, right, without this immense amount of violence. It cannot exist without the genociding of people. And so fascism is both fascism and then just kind of like rote liberalism are really just like two sides of the same liberal coin. And so there's still this like the idea of the beacon on the hill. Those people who stormed into the Capitol building on Wednesday, they want to recuperate America.
Yeah, they're invested in America.
They're invested in America. The fucking corporate Democrats are invested in America. All of these people, I don't give a fuck where they're at on the political spectrum. They are all invested in America.
Alright, well done for getting to the end of this video. If you have done, if you're here, then I do love you. And I'm not just doing that to facilitate a parasocial relationship. It's deep, almost sensual love. But I am very tired, if you can't tell, because I've been editing for very long and it's late at night. So let's get through this quickly. Massive thanks to everyone who read quotes in this video. They've all got frankly stunning, beautiful voices, and you should subscribe to their YouTube channels and Twitch channels, which are all linked in the description below. And specific thanks to Ronan Youngblood and the Serfs for providing me with some sources at the start of my research for this. That was really helpful. They've got stuff both linked in the description as well. Also massive thanks to my patrons who are helping me make this video and to get through my PhD. Particular thanks to Paul Singleton, Tamas Kispiter, Seamus Morrison, Stephanie Beverley, Sinan, J. Fraser Cartlight, Jantapot, Nelly Zacheva, Mercutio, Sean McIntyre, and Cameron Blakeman, Luke Evans and Gary Dillon. If you'd like to support me on Patreon, you can go to patreon.com/JohnTheDuncan or give a one-off donation using Ko-fi. There we are. Blasted through it. Well done. To both of us. Love you. Alright, I better take this stuff off before I look any more ridiculous. What? Changing and I will be pulling for the times to open the door. It's time for a change. We can't capitulate as history repeats. My hands will trip.